identified as Appendix A, which is U.S. constitutional provisions on presidential elections. And then if you go about midway through to page 623, we've got the federal law on presidential elections as well in here. So I'm going to refer to a couple of things in this handout. There's two things I want to mention or comment on before I get started with this. And how does this work, Lana?
Oh, use the arrows. Just down arrow and move. There you go.
There we go. The first is, I think it's really, really important to recognize and understand that when we look at the way we elect the President of the United States, that we're looking at this in different levels of legal structure. What we're looking at it is from the Constitution, the U.S. constitutional standpoint, from a federal law standpoint, and from a state law standpoint. And it's very important to recognize that state law has a huge impact and influence on how we go about as a state addressing the Electoral College, how we go about as a state supporting the election of one president over another. And I think it's really important, I can't remember, Rhonda, you made a comment when you and Kim were having the exchange there that it's important to get your vote out there and make sure that you do participate in the process at the state level, regardless whether it's Maryland or New Mexico. And I want to take that to the next step. When we address the Electoral College, we have the power in this state to determine how we're going to participate in the Electoral College process. The overall structure, the guiding structure, was established constitutionally. We'll talk about that. But what they didn't do in 1787 was they didn't explain how the states were going to implement this process. So we have a lot of power as a state on how we participate in electing the president. The other thing I wanted to comment was something that Maggie had said, and I want, as we go through this process and through the next couple of meetings, I'd like for everyone to be thinking about one of the things you said, and if you could help me, because I can't quote you, and if I paraphrase, but what you said was something along the lines of, I can't support a change to how the Electoral College works right now because of the importance it is to New Mexico.
I didn't say I can't support it. I said that that's a concern, probably the major concern of mine, and I think that it makes New Mexico relevant
That
to
was,
presidential
yeah, that's what it
candidates.
was.
Yeah.
And that's the key thing that you said was relevance. Relevance for New Mexico as opposed to the relevance to a single voter somewhere. And that's really a distinction that's really important, because if we have an Electoral College structure that is not based on a winner-take-all in every state, but rather it's based on a situation where every vote in every state is accumulated at the national level for one candidate or another, it changes that. It changes what's happening in Maryland, because regardless of which party you're in, your vote's going to count for your candidate at a national level. And that's the distinction. Do we want this to be important for the state, or do we want this to be important for the individuals that are participating in the franchise? And if we can elevate that and increase the number of people that are participating, that's a pretty significant thing right there.
I have a response to that, but I'll save it for later.
I figured you would. Okay, so let's start. A recurring theme then in discussions that we have about the Electoral College is this whole thing about the intentions of the founding fathers. What was it that they really meant when they structured this thing the way they structured it? Why did they structure it that way? We've gotten a lot of information from Kim on that. And I think one of the objectives that we have for this citizen panel is to encourage thought and deliberation and debate about the principles of governance considered by our founding fathers as they struggled to put together this system, to put together the Constitution, to put together the Electoral College, why it looks the way it looks, and that sort of thing. But one of the major problems in this debate is discerning exactly what the founding fathers did have in mind, what they meant, what they wanted to do. Kim, I think, hit on a number of those issues, and then I want to try to touch on them as well. And I want to also reiterate Please jump in, very open, flexible. Maggie, don't feel like you have to wait to answer that question. Okay, so let's start then with the constitutional basis for the Electoral College. We've got Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2. You've got that right in front of you. Basically what it's saying is that the states are going to determine, the state legislatures are going to determine how they're going to go about awarding their Electoral College votes. And Alana cautioned me about doing this, but I wanted to actually read out, just so that we know structurally what's going on, and David's probably going to. The President, okay, starting out, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators or representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress, but no senator, representative, or person holding an office of trust or profit under the U.S. shall be appointed as elector. So we're starting out, we're saying we're going to have electors that are going to be voting for the President of the United States. We're not having people do it, we're having electors do it. That's the first thing. There's this wild process, if you look at federal law and constitutional law, as to how these electors go about casting their vote for the President. And I'm not going to get into the detail, but we'll look at some of that stuff. But bottom line, the way it happens, and that's in the Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3, President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open certificates, the votes from the Electoral College members, from those people participating in that process, and tally all those things. That's what they do. And then they talk about issues relating to what if in the Electoral College process we have someone that doesn't win the majority of the Electoral College votes. So the idea is the Electoral College, we always have this number 270 in our heads, right? You got to reach 270. That's modern day, that's the number of representatives and senators that we have now is a much lower number way back when. But it's that number, and conceptually, when these guys started doing this, outside of the first election of George Washington, the idea was that the Electoral College would never be able to reach a consensus and get a majority vote for one of the candidates coming out of the Electoral College. And that's one of the reasons, I think, that we have the kind of system that we have. They structured it then, if you don't have a majority coming out of the Electoral College, what happens is the House votes on it. So there's like this two-step process that they had in place. The Electoral College, which was established by the states determine who's going to participate in that and how the state is going to award those electoral votes. Those people, they vote their mind. They're going to send their vote to this House, the President of the Senate. The Senate's going to count all these things up. And lo and behold, no one's going to win. And so they conceived, conceptually, it was going to be a two-step process that the House then was going to select from the top 5, originally with the 12th Amendment, the top 3 individuals that were selected by this group of people. So they always envisioned sort of this side that was a popular aspect to it. The states and the people are going to determine who they send, what names they send up. But then Congress, the House, was ultimately going to be the determiner as to who became the president. And I just mentioned the 12th Amendment here. David, I should quit reading this stuff, shouldn't I? I think people may realize the 12th Amendment came out, it was ratified, I think, in 1804, and one of the big reasons that it even came into existence, or they had this problem, was when they had a president of one party and a vice president of another party. There was a lot of debate over that process, and so the 12th Amendment rectified that situation, but it also added some other changes to how the Electoral College worked. Changes that are mechanical that we don't really need to get into right now. But I think the important thing also is to recognize that over time, from 1787, the Electoral College has actually been changed as an institution 5 different times in how it operates. This is the only change that was constitutional. All those other changes were due to the effect and force of political parties rising up at the beginning of the 19th century, and states changing the way they were doing it, going from fractional to, going from, fractional to winner take all and back to fractional in certain instances. So then we also, is that the right one? Election day. So what we're looking at, and we all know this, the first Tuesday, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, this is when electors, right? Electors get elected, not the president. The president's not elected that day. The electors are elected that day, and they're elected at the state level. The election of the president actually occurs later. This occurs in December. I don't know how they come up with this stuff. First Monday after the second Wednesday in December. But that's when it is. This is when the president is actually elected. Now, this was changed in '34. They actually, the inauguration early on was like in March as opposed to January. And so the statute, there was a change in when the inauguration occurred, and that's why. But anyway, it's sort of an odd thing. But the president's not actually elected until December. And this is sort of getting back to one of Lana's slides, which was under the Constitution, the people who are eligible voters, electors under state law, eligible voters, vote for their U.S. representatives, and then since 1913, we voted for our senators. What we haven't done, what's important, is we have no federal constitutional right to vote for the president or for the vice president. And this is the other thing, we do not have a right to vote for the electors. Again, if you look back to the first page here in Article 2, I've got it highlighted, you guys don't, but the electors are determined by how the state legislature wants to do that. The legislature can give that vote to the people, but we do not have a federal constitutional right to vote for the electors. And then we've got a little jurisprudence here for Professor over here, and Paul, and you guys. In 1892, the Constitution does not provide that the appointment of electors shall be by popular vote, nor that the electors shall be voted for upon a general ticket, nor that the majority of those who exercise the elective franchise can alone choose the electors. It's not to the people. To the legislature of the state that determines how that's going to happen. Now, we do that. We vote that way in New Mexico, but it's entirely possible. Where'd Nate go?
Don't give them any ideas.
Right. It's entirely possible that the legislature can pull that back. They would be insane to try to do that, but you can do it. The possibility is there. And then in 2000, I think everyone probably is familiar with this situation. The individual citizen has no federal constitutional right to vote for electors for the President of the United States unless and until the state legislature chooses a statewide election as the means to implement its power to appoint members of the Electoral College. So there's a history. I mean, structurally, you look at it, and it just, people weren't involved. They weren't, and it gets back to what Kim was saying, tyranny from above, tyranny below. These two pressures acting on them. They wanted to control it. They did a really good job with this structure. And we're going to talk about some ways of living with and maybe adjusting that structure. And so there is one place then where there's a state constitutional right. Not a federal constitutional right, but a state constitutional right, and that's Colorado. And this was actually part of the articles that they put together before they actually became a state. All right, so let's talk about some of the nitty-gritty details of the Electoral College. How many electors? Okay, Electoral College representation is equal to congressional representation. In New Mexico, we had 3 House members, 2 senators, so we've got 5 electoral votes here. That's how it works. And this gets to an issue, I can't remember whether Lana said this or Kim said it, but if you look at this right here, this is really kind of interesting. And this gets to that whole notion of one vote counting more in one state than another state. Now, the way we operate with regard to, there's a fixed number of congressmen in the House, 435. It used to be years ago that number kept growing as the country was growing, and at some point, you may know, or Paul, you may know, I don't know when that changed, but we've got a ceiling on the number of congressmen and women that can serve. And so with that ceiling, there's a shifting then in population, there's a shifting in congressional representation that has a direct effect on the Electoral College votes. And so if you look, the population in 1988, okay, and so the prior census would have been in 1980. California grew so much between 80 and 88 that they should have had an additional 7 electoral college votes, but they only had 47 because it was based on the census that occurred 10 years prior. This is not a responsive system to modern society from the standpoint is we have changing and shifting populations a lot. New Mexico, we're growing. At least we were, I think we still are. At least under Governor Richardson we were growing. Sorry, I had to do that. Anyway, moving right along.
Well, if I may intercede, and I'm noticing, I just looked at this before I came here, and we are seeing now, Texas is going to have more votes, Arizona is going to have more votes. We've lost votes that have diminished in Illinois, Michigan, Massachusetts. So you see states losing power, other states gaining based on economics, their politics, what they attract to their states. It just seems like that plays a huge role. We're going to feel it in 2012. And it's going to affect strategies, I think, greatly.
It will. It will. It's interesting how the Electoral College can have such an impact and influence on the way presidential, I guess it shouldn't be surprising, but on the way presidential politics and elections is run. That's why no one goes to Maryland. Everyone goes to New Mexico. But if you change this framework that says really it's the individual that's more important than the state interest, the individual's interest in participating in the franchise. Anyway.
Then politics would still play a part because they would go to where they would get the biggest bang for their buck.
That was going to be my point.
And, well, okay, so is the issue...
Sorry.
Oh, but look, I mean, this is great. But the question again reverts back to that. As an individual voter, does Kim actually care whether, let's go back to Nixon McGovern, whether George McGovern or Richard Nixon come to New Mexico? What she cares about is when she goes to vote on Tuesday, the first Tuesday after the first Monday, what she cares about is whether her vote is going to have an impact on who becomes president. And we've already seen, Lana put that out there, we've had instances where the person who got the most popular votes, 4 times, did not win the presidency. And it's a question. I'm not telling you what's right and what's wrong, but I think if you're not putting it in those terms, and I think it's very easy for people who are involved in politics at the state level to say, oh my God, it's really important for the state to have to be a battleground or a swing state because we get all the candidates coming here. Well, yeah, you get to sit on the stage with Obama or with George McGovern, shake his hand and get your picture taken. She doesn't, but the question is whether her vote counts nationally. All definitely, all due respect to you.
Frankly, who cares if the candidate comes to New Mexico? If communications the way they are today, I'm going to know as much as I'm ever going to want to know about all of them.
That's a good point. I shouldn't be, I'm sorry.
Angela wanted to say something, but I have.
I feel terrible.
It's not about the candidate coming to the state, it's about the president being responsive, the federal government being responsive to these small states. It's once you're elected.
Is California a small state?
No, of course not.
I don't think the presidential candidates went there to raise money during the last cycle.
I'm not talking about the election process, I'm talking about the governance process. I'm talking about, as an institution, if the small states don't matter, then the way politics plays out in governance, then these states are going to lose. They're going to lose in grants, they're going to lose in where things are located, they're just going to keep losing. And so it's a power issue, but not about, it's a power issue that's bigger about whether the candidate comes to the state. Does that make sense?
Yes, I understand, absolutely. I understand what you're saying.
It's great that they come to the state, but that's not what this is about. This is about power in a federal system, in my view.
Yeah, but all I know is since we're losing the 2 senior senators in New Mexico is now going to be in bad shape. It's got nothing to do with the president. It has to do with the laws of the United States senators. for very, very long term.
But because of our electoral college votes, the leadership is going to care about listening to these senators and listening to this state. For now, well,
I think we're getting a little ahead of ourselves in terms. I probably am going way afield on what I should be on. But this is an issue that's going to get addressed. I think it's the second and third meeting.
This is the heart of the issue.
It's going to get addressed. All right, Maggie.
I'm sorry. Okay, so since we're talking about it, and I apologize if I'm dragging us further afield, but so state relevance versus individual relevance. I think first of all to say that I as a voter don't care if the president comes to the state, number one, is making a rational actor assumption about voters, which I think we all agreed at the outset was not necessarily the way to approach it. And number two, it's antithetical to what we all know and believe about campaigns, that coming to a state, giving it attention, investing resources, has something to do with the eventual outcome of the election. And I think structurally, campaigns are if you're going to run a national election, you have to boil all of these 350 million individuals down into some structural unit in which to manage a campaign. Right now, the state provides that structural unit. Elections are managed at the state level, and unless we are going to propose a federal election for president managed by the federal government, which the Constitution does not have, allocate the power to do, states run elections, I don't see how you can change that unit of organization in terms of elections and in terms of campaigns. So that was sort of my point. I love the concept that all of a sudden a federal election becomes relevant to an individual if you get rid of the Electoral College. But I think there are other structures in place that will still maintain that necessity for states and media markets. Let's get real. National campaigns are really run at the media market level, not really at the state level, even in that sense. So anyway, that's why
Okay,
I'm sorry.
Thank you. No, I probably went a little far afield. But I do appreciate that. Okay, who nominates the electors then? So this is the idea, how the states determine how their electors are going to be selected. All right? And so, again, this has sort of changed through time, that now the most common state conventions of political parties, state central committee, with Pennsylvania, it's actually the nominees from within the parties get to select them in Pennsylvania. The way we do it, then, and should I put you guys on the spot? Okay, so I'm gonna, again, David, please bear with me. There's 3 or 4 statutes that actually address this. So the way it works here is on or before June 1 of each year in which there is a presidential election, the Secretary of State sends a notice to the state chairman of each qualified political party setting forth the method and requirement for nominating electors for the president, section 115.1. Presidential electors are to be nominated at the party's state convention according to party rules. Now what I was going to do was take a look at those, but I'm not sure what they are for either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. Do you know, Paul, how the Republicans do it?
Sort of.
So I guess it doesn't matter. It probably happens at the state convention, and either it's an outright vote of everybody, or
just want somebody who's reliable, who will actually vote for president.
and not be a faithless elector.
Right. I mean, and believe me, we sweat that. I mean, you never know.
Right.
But that's the chief criterion.
So it's probably
Are they faithful to the nominee?
right. So it may be that the central committee for each party, or it may be, everyone votes. I don't know.
Nate, we will get an email that says throw out your name, and then it starts to go less, and they eventually come up with a slate.
Right.
And it is, it's a rubber stamp sort of vote. I mean, by the time it gets to that level, there's no doubt.
Who's gonna, right.
A lot of it's honorary. You'll find some, some old timers, some special people, people like that who are definitely reliable.
And see, that's really interesting, because that actually is one of the things that's changed evolutionary through the history of the electorate, the electors themselves, what their demographic is, for lack of a better word. Initially, as Kim had pointed out, and the literature supports this, they were supposed to be statesmen. They were supposed to be people who exercised good independent judgment on who the right person should be for president. That's what they were supposed to do. But boy, I tell you, by 1800, folks were not liking that idea at all. And they changed that, and it very rapidly went into these people need to be party members, they need to be contributing to the candidates, and they need to be reliable. If they're selected to support the Federalist Party, then they better, by gosh, vote for the Federalist Party candidate. And that was the first faithless elector.
Isn't it true that there have been pretty rare faithless electors? So
There's a number, I mean, if you want to know, it's not that rare. There's been a lot of them. Richard Nixon got 3, one for every
But
time.
actually, the faithless elect, I mean, when you elect somebody on that Tuesday and then you have that vote in December, we always worry about what happens if something pops up during that month-long process. Who knows the trash and garbage that may come out? And I guess it's sort of a cooling off period that if we made the wrong decision on who we voted for and something really terrible comes out, they could all just say, oh gosh, we got to vote for somebody else. So, but we do sweat that month-long period. You know, is something, you know, the October surprise, or will we have the late November or December surprise? So we just, you know, we quiver and shiver while we wait for them to get together.
Okay, thank you. So then, I'm sorry. I have no clue. I don't know who they were. They don't show up on the ballot. I've got a ballot in here. Thank you. And interestingly enough, up until like the 60s, the presidential candidates didn't necessarily show up in the ballots. It was the electors that actually showed up on the ballots. And so you voted for electors, and this gets to a really interesting thing that Kim and I were talking about the other day, which is the 1960 Kennedy-Nixon election, where Alabama did, on their ballots, they had 11 electors for each party, Dem and Republican. And the Democratic Party, during their convention, could not get a pledge from all 11 of their electors that they would support John Kennedy if he was elected. And so ultimately what ended up happening, and I'm getting way ahead of myself, Kennedy was elected, but if those 5 11ths had not somehow magically gone to Kennedy, that would have turned that around, I think. And Nixon never challenged it legally. He probably could have. But it's interesting about faithless electors and pledged electors and that sort of thing. They were selected by the Democratic Party as however state law and party rules require it, but they were selected as unpledged electors. They sent them on their way knowing that they either would not or may not vote
They
for
try to
Kennedy.
make that a crime, but you can't make it a crime to be a faithless elector. It's supposed to be a 4th-degree felony.
In New Mexico.
But you couldn't, I don't think you could ever prosecute this.
Well, there are 16 states that actually have that if you don't do what you're supposed to do, it's a crime. There are 26 states then where they have either pledges total. 16 is part of the 26, but 26 total say you're supposed to be casting a
I
ballot.
don't think state law can commit you to vote the way they want you to vote. I just think you have problems with that.
No one's prosecuted one of those.
I have a really dumb question, I guess, but if you have both parties selecting their electors, then why don't we have splits when it comes to having the final vote for the president?
Because it's a winner-take-all system. Under
Well,
state-
then, yes, but then, so the person who's the losing elector just has to vote for the other, the one, or?
They don't even get the
They don't know. Let me,
Yeah.
what happens is the state parties determine who their electors are going to be. At that point in time, when they, up until election day, they are nominees to be electors. So you got in New Mexico, 5 from the Republican Party, 5 from the Democratic Party, and then I don't know if we've ever had a green that was actually, but depending on the number of parties, you may have 5 for each. And then after election day, the winner, you know, in the state is determined at some point, and then it's those electors for whether it's the Democrat or the Republican, it's those electors then that go and actually vote. They're no longer nominees. They're now elected electors, and the other 5, whatever party lost, they're not nominees anymore. They're just, they lost, the losers. So it wouldn't be a split. I can tell I'm not explaining that very well.
So if Obama wins, all 5 electors from New Mexico will be from the Democratic Party. It's not proportional. In other words, there's not 3 for Obama and 2 for McCain. There's just all All of the 5 will be
Even though
Democrats.
they were elected to be faithful in their charge, if they were Republicans and said, we promise we'll vote.
If McCain
They
had
didn't
won,
win.
then they would have been the Republican guys.
But, so the Republican electors are all knocked out, is that it?
Correct.
They
But
were
if-
voted down.
Voted
They weren't
down.
elected, basically, they weren't elected.
Winner take all.
Yeah, they're standing in. They're standing in on the ballot, really, for the president and the vice president. I mean, we have the president and the vice president. What's that slide? Now, we've already talked about that, right? I'll come back. Where the hell's other is? So it used to be that instead of having Barack Obama and Joe Biden, they had a whole list of electors. In New Mexico, it'd be 5 names. These guys wouldn't even be on there. Same with McCain. They would have had another 5 for the Republican side. You wouldn't even have voted. And that's what happened in Alabama in '60. They didn't even have the candidate's name. They didn't have Kennedy or Nixon on the ballot. It was the electors that were on the ballot. Crazy way it works.
But then when it's all over, regardless of the number, the electors all go one way or the other.
They're supposed to. They don't always, but they're supposed to. I went through those other ones. Let me take a look and see if, I'm probably way over my time.
No, you're not. No.
I'm not?
No, you're not. But this is a good point. This, I think, follows up on this point about how the electors are. So when you're voting for Barack Obama, notice it doesn't mention that the electors who are actually representing him. You're actually not voting for Barack Obama, you're voting for electors. And so if Barack Obama wins, then his slate gets to go to the State House, and the Republican slate doesn't. So you're actually electing them to be the institutional body to go to that State House. And they used to be on the ballot, but they're.
Let me, actually, there's a couple of pretty good quotes, if you don't mind. So, first of all, the probable intent of the founding fathers was that the Electoral College would act as a deliberative body wherein they would exercise independent and detached judgment as to who the best person would be to serve for president and vice president. A citizen panel, if you will, of distinguished members of society. Sorry. Okay, then quote, as the select assemblies for choosing the president will in general be composed of the most enlightened and respectable citizens, there is reason to presume that their attention to their votes will be directed to those men only who have become the most distinguished by their abilities and virtue. That was Hamilton in Federalist 64. So again, it's this whole idea of electors were supposed to be statesmen and that sort of thing. However, let's see, as of 1826, Senate Select Committee observed that electors were usually selected for their devotion to party, their popular manners, and a supposed talent for electioneering. So even in the early 19th century, they were getting away from the statesman stuff. And they were going, look, from a practical standpoint, and there's a great, great letter from Thomas Jefferson to, is it Adams, I think? Don't tell me. Sorry. Winner take all. This is that winner take all idea. On January 12th of 1800, Thomas Jefferson, the losing Republican candidate from the 1796 election, mind you, wrote to James Madison, a then powerful Virginia state legislator, quote, on the subject of an election by a general ticket, the statewide winner-take-all rule, and that's a paraphrase, or by districts, because they started out districting, would be best, or by districts, most persons here seem to have made up their minds, all agree that an election by districts would be best if it could be general, but in the context of 10 states choosing either by the legislature or by a general ticket, it is folly and worse than folly for the 6 not to do it, meaning for the 6 other states not to do a winner-take-all system. That's what he was saying. And they ended up, in Virginia then, they ended up changing the law to a winner-take-all for the next election, which Jefferson then won. So they were aware of this political aspect, this faithfulness to the party. Screw statesmanship, man. I want to make sure, and this is another guy, there's a great quote. Miles Faithless elector Samuel Miles, a 1796 Federalist elector from Pennsylvania who declined to vote for John Adams. He cast his vote for Thomas Jefferson in '96. Even at this early point, this was a shock to those folks. An article in the United States Gazette at the time quoted an angry Federalist saying, "What? Do I choose Samuel Miles to determine for me whether John Adams or Thomas Jefferson be president? No, I choose him to act, not think." They get totally away from this idea of independent
You would have a
thought.
second campaign then, from Tuesday through that date in December. I mean, you'd have another crazy campaign, and it wouldn't quite be chaos.
Well, but you know, what's interesting is it's state legislators that determine how the states do this.
Yeah.
And so I'm pretty confident it'll never work into that kind of situation,
Right.
since the states are the ones doing this. I don't even know where I am on this slideshow yet. Mexico ballot. Okay, so since the midnight, we already talked about that. Candidate with the most votes receives all the electoral college votes. Historically, district division of EC votes was common until 1836, and in Maine in '69 and Nebraska in '92 went back to the districted system.
You said it was 72 and 96.
It was for those elections.
Oh, for those elections, okay.
Those were the first elections when they went
Right.
back.
Right. When do electors cast their vote? We already talked about this. It's in December. That changed it was later on, earlier in our history. So the President of the Senate is the one that actually does, and it's done on January 6th. Are electors bound? This is what we were talking about before. So there's 26 states that attempt to bind them. And New Mexico, actually, it is a fourth-degree felony in New Mexico to not vote the candidate that you were selected for. And yeah, that's sort of an interesting anecdotal thing. Nixon, every time he ran for president, he had at least one defector.
From which party?
Pardon me?
From which party? From his party?
Well, what?
Well, no, yeah,
Factors against him.
against him.
Against him. Yeah, I'm sorry, yeah. Yeah. Summary, constitutional legal structure. Okay, so what we were supposed to talk about during this presentation was kind of the structure that we're looking at. I didn't do justice to the state laws, but it's actually not, there's not very much. It's pretty short stuff. There's not a lot to it. And there's not a lot to the federal law as well. You can see, I mean, it's there. It's pretty straightforward on how they do it. It's really how we go about implementing it at the state level that was where the rubber meets the road.
I just, on that point, I think it's really interesting. I mean, that neither you nor you really are able to tell us how it works for within either of the party structures is pretty weird. I mean, and not in a bad way, but I mean, you're two probably the most knowledgeable people that I can think of respective to your parties about the bylaws, et cetera. And that's just really interesting.
Daniel
How
Soto
obscure it, well, he might, yeah, you're right, Daniel. But-
he would probably be correcting me throughout this whole
But, I
thing.
mean, it just goes to show you, I think, how obscure.
It is, yes. Your point is exactly right.
But it also shows how little I care about it. And it matters
Well,
because the
it's so
five people
perfunctory.
we always send up are always reliable. I mean, I don't lose any sleep over the five that we have chosen in the past.
And that's great. And I think what we're going to do, hopefully, through this process is we're going to sort of shift you over into a new framework of thinking about this. And that has to do with, well, that has to do with what's more important. Is it at the individual level from a voting standpoint, or is it a state interest, or is it a political campaign or party interest? I really think that's where the crux of the issue. So, I mean, yeah, we'd love to have continued debate on that. Mechanics of how it works, the intention of the founding father, the results, and I think this is really important. That this was constitutional, intentionally, they did it on purpose, they thought about it, they didn't like it, it was the second best, right? It was the least worst way of doing it, and it was
Which is often
intentional.
the case.
What's that?
Which is often the case in all policies.
That's how Congress works. The mechanism for which was intentionally left to the states. So it's a state issue. We can do it the way we want to. Now, do I have it? Are any of those change slides in here?
Yes.
Oh, cool. You did get them in there. Wait. Oh, I was looking, okay, yeah. Okay, so this goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is actually kind of an encapsulation of how the Electoral College has changed since 1787. So originally we talked about this, the constitutional intent was free electors, they were statesmen, they were to exercise independent judgment and be smart and you know, cast their ballot for the person most suited to serve as president. Now it's pledged electors, they have to be faithful, we don't want unfaithful electors because we need to make sure that they support the person that the party has selected. The party has selected. Originally it was a two-step process. We talked a little bit about that, so that you have a tie in the Electoral College. It goes to Congress to make a determination. They thought that that would always be the case. There's a quote I have for that. I won't try looking for it, but basically what it says is that everyone knew that George Washington was going to be the first president. There was no debate, discussion, or anything. Everyone supported him for president. But after that, they knew there was going to be a lot of fighting. And one of these guys was saying, you know, a George Washington may come along every 19 or 20 years, or 30 or 40, actually 19 out of 20 times. So that'd be, what, 80 or 100 years. We may have another George Washington. But they were convinced, absolutely convinced in 1787, that the Electoral College would not select somebody with a majority of their votes. That they would always have someone who did not reach, they would never have anyone that would reach 50% of the electoral votes. And they built the process so that the Congress, and this is another interesting thing, if you guys don't know this, that congressionally, they didn't vote by membership, they voted by state. So your congressional delegation decided what way the state was going to go for any of this suite or slate of candidates that were out there, and you only got one vote per state for voting for the president. And there were times, or they contemplated the time when a state could not agree. They had an even number of electors. They couldn't agree on the candidate. They couldn't even participate. They were out. Sorry, can't do it. Anyway, two-step process. Legislative selection of electors to popular. This is, you know, I think everyone likes that idea. District rule for apportionment of vote, fractional or district, and a winner-take-all. That's the new approach to things, except for that, Nebraska and Maine. And electors voted for one candidate. Winner was president. Second was VP. Okay, and now we cast separate ballots, one for president, one for VP. This is the 12th Amendment change right here. This is the only constitutional change in the Electoral College since 1787. The only one. All of this, these are radical changes in how this system works. Radical. Some of it is state law based, some of it is just operational. That's how it changed.
And wasn't it true, though, that in the election where Jefferson won, that they were so disgusted with the process of going through the House vote 36 times and the backroom dealing and the politics that was done, they then amended the Constitution to prevent that.
That's exactly right. You did your reading.
Well, there's another thing. I think we haven't spent enough time on, and that's the constitutional intent, because I think that these were fairly well-to-do people from their states. They were quite mindful that they had a lot of people in the states with guns who had just finished fighting the British. And I don't think they completely trusted the people. They wanted these statesmen initially, so they could feel that way through this. They weren't real confident that these people would behave.
That's the question I wanted to ask. At the time when the Constitution was enacted, what were the qualifications for voting?
Well, I can start with white male.
I
don't think you had to carry a gun.
But what did you have to own? Or what was the property qualification? Because it seems to me that we've had to have many amendments over the years to establish, other than this kind of oligarchic.
Okay, I'm going to take a little step out on a limb on constitutional jurisprudence with regard to who is a qualified elector. I believe that states, it really rests with the states, is how they're going to determine who qualified electors are. So the states made that determination. So for instance, there were states that actually had women's suffrage before the...
Montana.
Yeah, what was the amendment? Whenever it was. Yeah, so there were states that had that, and I think that, but the constitutional changes that then occurred, I don't think they were, what you can't do is you can't discriminate against people for certain things, and that has to do with, I don't have it in my head, but that was the determiner that said, states, you can't discriminate against people participating in the franchise on the basis of ethnicity, religion, and these other things.
What about property ownership? This is the
But I think that was a state
about
issue.
The original.
Again, that was a state issue.
It varied by state. It varied by state, and actually the franchise pretty quickly went to all white males. I mean, it maybe 20 years or something, I'm guessing, but roughly, the franchise really moved quickly for that group, regardless of property ownership, but it did start out mostly property ownership. In fact, before the Constitutional Convention, there were places where women had the right to vote because they had property. And then, of course, if you got married as a woman, you lost your property at that point. But
that was specific to states.
But that was specific, and then once we had the Constitution, then we had the property requirements, and women actually lost the vote in some places. And then when they built the franchise, it was all built around white men. But that happened very quickly from property owner, these qualifications. It did expand very quickly.
All right, this is the last thing. I think the key flexibility built into the Constitution permitted the development of a system that is today very different from the one founding fathers had envisioned. People may disagree with that, but and that's something we can talk about further. This built-in flexibility is flexibility of the original Constitution remains today, and it honors the idea of state sovereignty and authority to implement how its citizens will elect the president. So, you know, you had mentioned something about changing the Electoral College or eliminating the Electoral College. You don't have to eliminate the Electoral College to make it so that everyone, when they vote, they're voting for the president directly.
Yeah, no, I agree. I guess what I was saying is to change the way that campaigns
That's going to be, yeah.
do business, you would have to change the unit of managing an election,
Couldn't agree more.
among other things, but that would be one of them.
Yeah, I mean, the business of presidential elections is built around the Electoral College as it exists right now. Winner take all, battleground and swing states.
And individual state laws about how they run elections and who gets to vote and when and all of that.
Right, right. Okay, that's it.